All right, welcome everyone. Let's dive right into the world of F1. We've got a ton to unpack today, especially after that qualifying session. You sent over some really interesting analysis of video, right?
Mm.
And it really focused on how Williams, Ferrari, and Aston Martin performed. So for this deep dive, let's use that video as our main guide.
Sounds good to me. It's always fascinating to break down a qualifying session almost as soon as it happens, you know? You get those immediate reactions and insights into how the teams are shaping up.
Exactly. And a huge shout out to all our new viewers joining us here at F1 Blogs. We are so excited to have you as part of our F1 community.
Absolutely. Welcome aboard, everyone.
Okay, let's kick things off with Williams. The video we watched really highlighted what could be a massive step forward for them during qualifying. I mean, Alex Albon's car looked seriously quick, and this wasn't just a fluke. It sounds like their preseason testing and their performance in Australia already showed they had that single lap speed.
Yeah, definitely.
But here's the thing. The analysis also hinted that their race pace might not be quite as strong. And the commentator in the video, well, they actually saw this as a positive thing, saying that starting higher up the grid, like in 6th and 10th, is a good strategy, even if they have to manage their tires a bit more during the race. What do you think about that? I mean, what's the biggest takeaway for you from this early look at Williams?
Well, what's really interesting here is, that potential trade-off that Williams might have made. They've clearly focused on that single lap performance, right? Which could mean they've set up the car to be super slippery through the air, especially for qualifying.
Right, I see.
But that could mean they sacrifice some downforce, the grip that keeps them glued to the track. That could explain why they're so quick over one lap, but maybe not so much over a whole race distance. It's all about finding that balance in F1, and how Williams manages their race strategy is going to be key. Can they turn these awesome starting positions into some serious points? That's the big question.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to Ferrari now. The video's analysis suggested that Carlos Sainz, well, he didn't look entirely happy during qualifying. Apparently, he was fiddling with the car setup quite a bit, which is often a sign that things aren't going exactly to plan.
Yeah, that can definitely be a red flag.
And there was also mention of potential damage to the floor of Sainz's car. It seems like he might have clipped a curb in Q2. The video pointed out that if there is damage, it'll make it even tougher for him to catch the front runners. But despite these little hiccups, both Ferrari drivers did manage to get into Q3, with Sainz finishing 10th. The commentator actually saw this as a positive, especially when you compare it to Mercedes, who seem to be struggling a bit more. So what are your first thoughts on Ferrari's showing in qualifying, based on what we saw in the video?
Well, when we look at the bigger picture of Ferrari's season so far, this qualifying session sort of highlights some of the challenges they've been facing. Getting both cars into Q3 is decent for sure, but the fact that Sainz was making all those setup changes and there's that possibility of floor damage suggests that things weren't as smooth as they'd like.
I see.
And floor damage, that's a big deal with these modern F1 cars. You see, a huge chunk of their downforce, the force that helps them stick to the track and corners, comes from the airflow under the car.
Oh, wow.
And even a tiny bit of damage can mess that airflow up big time, meaning they lose grip and overall performance. I think the commentator was right to focus on the fact that they got both cars into Q3. It's a tricky sport, F1, and sometimes just making it to that top 10 shootout can feel like a win in itself, especially when things aren't perfect.
I completely agree. Okay, so next up is Aston Martin. The commentator in the video seemed more worried about them than about Williams, actually. They said that both Aston drivers looked like they were having a hard time throughout practice and qualifying. It seems the car was a bit of a handful to drive, both with low fuel and high fuel, which, when you contrast it with Williams, who at least had that pace on low fuel, paints a different picture, right?
Definitely.
Fernando Alonso ended up qualifying 12th. And just like with Sainz, they talked about the possibility of floor damage on Alonso's car, which could have played a part in their performance.
Yeah.
But the commentator didn't want to put it all down to damage. They said it could also be because they were pushing the car really hard. Despite all this, though, Alonso was quoted as being happy with the first qualifying of the season. He seemed pretty optimistic about getting points in the race, too. He knows they might not have the fastest car right now, but he believes they've got a solid foundation to build on. What stands out to you about Aston Martin's assessment in the video?
Well, it brings up a really fascinating point about expectations versus reality in F1, right? You've got this picture of Aston Martin struggling to get a consistent handle on their car, which isn't ideal. And while Alonso's always great at keeping the team motivated, these handling issues might be more than just finding that last little bit of speed,
Right.
especially when you compare them to Williams, who were clearly quick with low fuel.
Yeah, good point.
The commentator's point about the damage maybe being a result of pushing the car too hard is interesting too. It might mean that Aston Martin is walking a tightrope with their car's setup. If they try to squeeze every bit of performance out of it, they risk breaking something important.
That makes sense.
It's a tricky balance, and it'll be interesting to see how they approach it.
For sure. Okay, let's broaden our view a bit now. The video also highlighted some performances that, well, surprised a few people. Yuki Tsunoda, driving for Racing Bulls, he snagged a fantastic 5th place in qualifying. And they really emphasized how well Williams performed, too, with Albon finishing ahead of both Ferraris and even Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, that was impressive.
The video made it clear just how much progress Williams seems to have made since last season. And they also mentioned that out of all the drivers who switched teams in the offseason, Gabriel Bortoleto was the only one who managed to out-qualify his new teammate this time around. The commentators saw all this as a potential shakeup to the usual order at the front of the grid. What are your thoughts? Does any of this broader picture surprise you, especially when you think about how everyone expected things to go?
It's super interesting to see, right? Because it might actually mean we're in for a shakeup of the competitive landscape in F1. I mean, Tsunoda getting 5th place for Racing Bulls, that shows how much they've improved.
Absolutely.
And Albon beating both Ferraris and a Mercedes, that's a clear signal that Williams has really made some gains with their car. And the fact that only one driver who switched teams managed to beat their new teammate, well, that says a lot about how long it takes to adjust to a new environment, you know? But it also makes Albon's performance even more impressive, considering where Williams was last year. These unexpected results are what make F1 so exciting. It shows that all the hard work the teams put into development and strategy is paying off. It's anyone's game.
I totally agree. So the video also included some direct quotes from Carlos Sainz after qualifying. He said he was happy for the team, that they got both cars into Q3, and he even gave Albon props for a great performance. Sainz's goal for his first qualifying session with Ferrari was to make it into Q3, and he did that. But he also admitted that he couldn't improve his Q2 time in Q3. He said he was still getting used to the car because of all the setup changes they'd been making, and he was having a bit of trouble finding the sweet spot with those soft tires. But even with that, he's staying positive. He thinks he can improve as the races go on. He also mentioned that he had a not-so-great lap in Q3, but he's not too worried about it. He just needs more time in the car to really understand it. He said, it's pretty normal for drivers who change teams to need a while to get fully comfortable. What do Sainz's comments tell you about how he's settling in at Ferrari?
I think it gives us a great insight into what it's like for a driver joining a new team, you know? He's happy for the team's success and recognizes Albon's drive, which shows he's got a good team spirit and understands the competition. But not being able to beat his Q2 time and feeling a bit lost with the car, that shows how tough it can be to adapt to a new machine, especially when you don't have a lot of track time to practice.
Yeah.
But he's optimistic about the races, which means he believes he can get there, and I'm sure he can. But he needs more time to unlock the car's potential, especially how it handles on those soft tires in qualifying. It's a good reminder that qualifying isn't all about the car's raw speed. The driver's confidence and how well they gel with the car are just as important.
Absolutely. We also got to hear from Fernando Alonso in the video. He said he was pretty happy with the first qualifying session, considering they weren't sure what to expect after winter testing. He explained they'd tried some different setups during practice, but it hadn't really worked out, so they went back to what they were using in the second practice session.
Okay.
He made a mistake during his Q2 lap, which could have led to some damage on the floor of the car, and that's probably why he qualified 12th. But he still sees it as a decent start to the season and thinks it puts some of their doubts about the car's speed to rest.
Good.
He admitted there are faster cars out there, but he believes Aston Martin has a good base to work from. Their main goal is to score points in the race. Oh, and he mentioned that if it rains, things could get a lot trickier because of visibility issues on some of the less straightforward parts of the Melbourne circuit. He also said they could have gotten into the top 10, which is interesting. What are your main takeaways from Alonso's perspective?
You know, it's fascinating to see how Alonso's comments are a little bit different from the commentator's cautious view on Aston Martin. Even though they had some issues, Alonso's focus is still on the positives. The car's solid base and their chances of getting points. Him talking about the setup experiments and going back to a previous configuration shows they're still fine-tuning the car.
I see.
And even though he made that mistake and there might be damage, he's still optimistic. That probably comes from his experience. He knows that even if they're not the quickest in qualifying, they can still do well in the race if the car runs smoothly.
Right.
Him mentioning rain adds another layer of complexity to the race, and him saying they could have made it to the top 10 suggests that the car might be quicker than their qualifying position shows. It'll be really interesting to see how they perform.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so wrapping up the video, the overall feeling was one of optimism, especially when it came to Williams' performance and what they could achieve. They also talked about how teams plan their development strategies. The commentator thinks that Williams might switch their focus to designing the 2026 car earlier than some of the top teams like Ferrari.
Interesting.
But they see Williams' strong start to this season as a really good sign. And when it comes to Aston Martin, the commentator's hoping that their confidence in their race pace, especially with a driver as experienced as Alonso, will help them have a better race.
Fingers crossed.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into that video analysis, what key insights stuck with you? We've seen what could be a huge improvement in Williams' qualifying pace, some setup headaches for Ferrari despite them getting both cars into Q3, and maybe a bit more of a worrying picture for Aston Martin when it comes to speed and handling, even though Alonso is staying positive. This qualifying session has set us up for what looks like a very exciting and unpredictable race.
You got that right. The main things I took away from it are that Williams has definitely found something that works for them in terms of single lap pace. Ferrari seems to be struggling to get consistent performance out of their car.
Yeah.
And Aston Martin, well, their qualifying struggles might not tell the whole story. Alonso seems to believe they can still do well in the race. It just goes to show how complex F1 is.
Exactly.
You can be great in qualifying, but that doesn't guarantee a win on Sunday. It works both ways.
Before we finish up, a quick reminder to everyone watching this deep dive on F1 blogs. If you enjoyed this analysis and you want to stay updated on all the latest F1 news, discussions, and reactions, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. We'll be bringing you all the insights and talking points from the world of F1. Thanks for tuning in to F1 Blogs.
And finally, thinking back to everything we've talked about today, Williams' surprising speed, Ferrari's ups and downs, Aston Martin's challenges, and those unexpected results from some of the other teams, what questions are you left with? What will you be watching closely during the race, or even for the rest of the season? Maybe you're curious about whether Williams can hold on to their starting positions, if Ferrari can sort out their setup and improve their performance, or if Aston Martin can turn their good base into points. This qualifying session has definitely given us a lot to think about as we head into race day.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more F1 analysis. Until then, keep those engines revving.
See you all next time.